Josh tried to run, but Shaq was faster. The shelves rattled as customers gasped. Nowhere to hide. No way out. "You scammed the wrong people," Shaq said, voice low, eyes locked on Josh. Josh's breath hitched. Come on, man, it was just business." Shaq pulled out his phone, smirking. "Yeah? Well, I just bought the business." Josh's face drained of color. His worst nightmare had just begun. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Shaq placed the bottle of water on the counter, his large hand barely wrapping around the flimsy plastic. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was something simple: water and a protein bar to refuel. But the moment the cashier rang him up, his eyebrows knitted together. "That'll be $17.50, the man behind the counter said lazily, barely looking up. Shaq blinked. "For water?" The cashier, Josh, a lanky guy with a greasy ponytail and a permanent smirk, tapped the register screen. "Water and a protein bar. That's the price." Shaq turned the bottle in his hand. Just a basic brand, nothing fancy. At most, it should have been a couple of bucks. He checked the protein bar. Probably around $3.50. "That doesn't add up," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. Josh shrugged, his smirk never faltering. "New store prices. Take it or leave it." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. $7.99 for a bottle of water? Josh leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. "Inflation, man, supply and demand, you want it or not." Shaq glanced around the store. The atmosphere was off, like a weight sat on the place. Customers kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. A woman near the bread aisle adjusted the contents of her basket, her lips pressing into a thin line. At the back of the store, an elderly woman gripped a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk. Her fingers trembled slightly as she counted out bills from her worn-out purse. A teenager in a hoodie hovered near the refrigerated drinks, sneaking nervous glances at the register. Shaq exhaled slowly, realization clicking into place. This wasn't just high prices. This was a scam. He turned back to Josh. "You the owner?" Josh snorted. "Nah, just running the place tonight. Boss is out." Shaq tilted his head. "And you just charge whatever you want?" Josh's smirk grew wider. "Hey man, you're Shaquille O'Neal. What's $17 to you?" Shaq ignored the jab. "What about her?" He nodded toward the elderly woman who was still hesitating over her total. "Is she getting the celebrity discount too?" Josh shrugged again, clearly unbothered. "Store policy. No refunds." Shaq kept his face neutral, but inside his patience was thinning. He didn't care about the $17. It wasn't about him. It was about everyone else. The way customers avoided the register, the way no one spoke up. Shaq slowly pulled out his card and slid it into the reader, the machine beeping as it processed. Josh grinned. "See? No big deal." Shaq took the receipt, but instead of leaving, he stepped back, arms crossed, and waited. The next customer approached, a frail old woman. Shaq paid close attention. He wanted to see just how deep this scam ran. Shaq didn't move toward the door. He had already paid, but something inside him told him to wait. Instead, he leaned against a shelf, arms crossed, and watched. A frail old woman in a faded cardigan stepped forward. Her hunched frame and slow movements spoke of years of struggle, and she clutched a small bag of groceries, just a loaf of bread and a pint of milk. She placed them on the counter, smiling politely despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Josh barely glanced at her before punching numbers into the register. "That'll be $12.75, he said flatly. Shaq frowned. Bread and milk shouldn't cost that much, especially in a store like this. The old woman's hands trembled as she unzipped a worn coin purse. She pulled out a few wrinkled bills, her fingers carefully counting them. She hesitated. I think that's too much," she said softly. Josh scoffed. "Prices went up, lady. That's the total." She counted her money again. A small sigh escaped her lips. "That's all I have." Josh didn't even pretend to care. He reached over, plucked a few coins from her change, and stuffed them in the register. Close enough. Next. The old woman looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she clutched her groceries and shuffled away slowly. Shaq's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze toward the next customer, a skinny teenager in a faded hoodie. The kid had a pack of instant noodles and a soda. Simple, cheap. Josh scanned them lazily. $9.50. The teen's eyes widened. That's not right." Josh leaned on the counter. "You gonna pay or what?" The teen hesitated. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating whether he should just walk out. But instead, He dug into his pockets, pulling out a crumpled $5 bill and some coins. "That's all I got." Josh sighed, dramatic. "Guess you're putting something back then." The kid's shoulders slumped. He slid the soda off the counter and pushed the remaining money forward. Josh swiped it up and bagged the noodles. "Next," Shaq exhaled sharply. This wasn't just an overpriced store. This was a full-blown scam. And it wasn't random. Josh was targeting people who couldn't fight back. The elderly, the young, those who had no choice but to pay whatever price he made up on the spot. Another customer stepped up, a father holding his young daughter's hand. She clutched a small bag of chips while her dad set a few cans of soup on the counter. Josh rang up the total. $32.40. The father blinked. That can't be right." Josh's smirk returned. "Prices are up, man." The father sighed, running a hand down his face. He didn't argue, just pulled out his wallet and swiped his card. But Shaq noticed something. Josh moved his fingers fast, pressing extra buttons on the register before completing the sale. The receipt printed, and the father took it without looking. Shaq, however, saw it clearly. An extra $10 had been added to the total. Enough. Shaq stepped forward, his large hand landing on the counter with a solid thud. Josh looked up, clearly irritated. "You need something else, big guy?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He tapped a finger against the counter, then gestured toward the last customer. "Run that last total again," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's see something." Josh's smirk wavered. "What?" Shaq didn't move. "Go ahead. Ring it up again." Shaq leaned in slightly, his towering frame casting a shadow over the counter. His voice was low, steady. "How about we check those receipts?" Josh's smirk faltered, but he covered it quickly, scoffing. "Man, why you making a big deal over a couple of bucks?" He folded his arms, leaning back like he had nothing to hide. Shaq didn't blink. "Run the last total again." The store went silent. Customers, who had been gathering their things, paused mid-step, sensing the shift in tension. The elderly woman from before clutched her bag of groceries tighter, her wrinkled fingers trembling slightly. The teenage employee behind the counter cast a nervous glance toward the back room, then quickly looked away. Josh hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly on the register. "Look, I don't do refunds." Shaq tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Did I ask for a refund?" Josh swallowed but forced another smirk. "Fine." He jabbed a few buttons on the register. A fresh receipt printed, and he snatched it, waving it in the air before slapping it onto the counter. "There. Happy now?" Shaq took the receipt, his sharp eyes scanning the numbers. And just as he suspected, the math didn't add up. The total was inflated. The tax percentage was far too high. And then there was an unmarked service fee tacked onto every purchase. The father, who had just checked out, stepped forward, frowning. "Wait, let me see that." Shaq handed him the slip, and the man pulled out his own crumpled receipt from earlier. He compared the two, his face darkening. This isn't right. You added 10 extra bucks to my total." Josh shrugged, feigning innocence. "Look, man, prices change. You're in here crying over pocket change?" The murmur of whispers among the crowd grew louder. A middle-aged woman shook her head. "I knew it. Last week I got overcharged too. Thought maybe I miscounted, but now..." A teenager at the back muttered, "He told me my card declined, but it went through. I checked later." Josh's confidence started to crack. All right, calm down. Look, sometimes the system glitches." Shaq turned his head slightly toward the teenage employee in the back. The kid looked tense, avoiding eye contact. "You work here," Shaq said, his voice steady but firm. "That true? The system just glitches?" The boy's lips parted. He hesitated, looking like he wanted to disappear. But then, in a small, shaky voice, he mumbled, "No, those aren't the real prices." The store erupted in gasps. A woman near the snack aisle scoffed. "I knew something was off. I bought milk yesterday and it was $6.50. Josh's face turned red. "Man, shut up. You don't even know what you're talking about." Shaq tilted his head, unimpressed. "Sounds like a scam." Josh clenched his fists, his smirk now fully gone. "Man, I don't make the rules. I just work here." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? That true?" Josh didn't answer. His hands fidgeted slightly on the counter. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone. Josh's eyes flickered to the device. A sudden flash of panic crossed his face. "Oh yeah?" Shaq said, tapping the screen. The camera started recording. Josh stiffened. Shaq's deep voice rumbled through the store, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Go ahead. Tell everyone why you're stealing their money. The camera locked onto Josh's pale face. Behind him, the teenage employee looked frozen, as if this was the moment everything would finally be exposed. Shaq's phone stayed steady in his massive hand. The camera locked onto Josh's now pale face. The once smug cashier swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as the weight of the moment settled in. The murmurs in the store grew louder, shifting from whispers to full-fledged accusations. Shaq's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Anyone else been overcharged? For a second, no one moved. Then, a middle-aged woman near the snack aisle raised her hand. Last week, I bought a loaf of bread and some eggs. Should have been $6, but he charged me $12. A man near the refrigerators scoffed. He told me the card reader was down and made me use cash. I checked my account later. Turns out my card actually went through. More voices joined in. He does this all the time. I thought I was losing my mind. I knew something was shady. Josh's head snapped around, his expression desperate. All right, chill out. Y'all act like I'm robbing a bank. It's just a few extra dollars. Shaq took a slow step forward, making Josh instinctively lean back. A few extra dollars from every single person who walks in here. He let the words hang, letting the weight of the accusation sink in. The young cashier in the back, barely 17 with wide, nervous eyes, fidgeted with the hem of his uniform. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the shelves. Shaq caught the movement. You, Shaq said, keeping his tone calm but firm. You work here, right? The kid nodded hesitantly. Shaq tilted his head slightly. How long's this been going on? The boy hesitated, glancing at Josh. The older cashier glared at him, shaking his head slightly. A silent warning. Shaq noticed. He softened his tone. You don't gotta protect him, kid. Just tell the truth. The boy's lip quivered. Then in a small voice he said, Since I started working here. The store erupted. Josh's panic was now impossible to hide. His eyes darted toward the exit, as if considering making a run for it. But Shaq wasn't done. What about the cameras? Shaq asked. Josh scoffed, regaining some of his bravado. They don't work. Haven't for months. The teenager swallowed hard. That's not true. Josh whipped his head around. Shut up, man. But it was too late. Shaq's eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh? So the cameras are working? The boy hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, they record everything. Josh's face turned a sickly shade of white. Shaq let out a short, amused exhale. Well now, that's interesting. He turned back to the teen. Pull it up. The store fell into silence as the young employee shuffled toward the back office. Josh clenched his fists, his breathing shallow. The truth was about to come out. The old security monitor flickered to life, its grainy black and white footage illuminating the small back office. A small group had gathered inside. Shaq, the nervous teenage employee, and a few customers who had pushed their way in, eager to see justice served. Outside, the crowd at the register grew, murmuring with anticipation. Shaq stood in the center, arms crossed over his massive chest, his presence dominating the tiny space. His sharp eyes never left the screen as the employee scrolled through hours of footage, sweat forming at his brow. Josh, now standing stiffly near the door, let out a dry chuckle, trying to mask his growing unease. Man, this is ridiculous. We're really digging through old footage over a couple of bucks? Shaq didn't even glance at him. His voice was cool, unreadable. Keep scrolling. The teenager hesitated before moving the cursor, fast-forwarding through hours of seemingly normal transactions. The screen showed customers coming and going, bags exchanged, money handed over. But then, wait. Shaq's deep voice cut through the room like a knife. The teenager's shaky hand rewound the tape. The grainy footage now showed Josh standing at the register, ringing up an elderly woman purchasing only milk and bread. The price displayed on the screen read $8.25, but as soon as she handed him a $10 bill, Josh pressed a button on the screen. The total suddenly jumped to $15.25. The woman on screen hesitated, counting her coins. Josh said something, nodding impatiently, and she eventually slid over the rest of her change. A collective gasp rippled through the store. That's me, a voice whispered. Everyone turned. The elderly woman from the footage stood near the door, her frail hands gripping the edge of her purse. Her eyes, filled with both shock and recognition, stared at the screen. Josh let out another nervous chuckle. Man, that could be anything. Maybe she... Keep playing it. Shaq's voice left no room for argument. The next clip showed a young father at the register, his daughter clinging to his leg. The total on the screen was $37.89, but as soon as the man looked down to swipe his card, Josh's hand moved quickly. $47.89. The father never even noticed. He simply took his receipt and walked out. The murmurs grew louder. Shaq let out a slow, measured breath. He shook his head, disappointment flickering in his eyes. "So this is what you do, huh? You steal from people who barely got enough to get by?" Josh's face turned red. "It's not like that." Then, the worst clip yet. Late at night. The store was empty. Josh was alone. He glanced over his shoulder, checking the aisles. The store was dark, closed to customers. Then, he popped open the register and grabbed a handful of cash. He didn't even count it. He stuffed it straight into his pocket, glanced around again, and walked off. A horrified silence filled the store. The teenage employee's mouth hung open. "He's stealing from the store, too." Josh visibly tensed. Now it wasn't just overcharging customers, it was theft. Straight-up robbery. Shaq's jaw tightened. His large hands curled into fists at his sides. "So, let me get this straight. You're not just scamming old ladies and families. You're robbing the very place that pays you?" Josh's eyes darted toward the exit. "Man, this is out of context," he stammered. "That could be anything. Maybe I was—" Shaq held up a hand. "Save it." The customers outside were no longer whispering. Their murmurs turned into outraged voices. "He did that to me too," someone shouted. "I thought I was just short on cash. He must have done it to me last week." Josh's breathing quickened. His hands fidgeted at his sides. He was losing control of the situation. A young mother in the crowd shook her head, clutching a small plastic bag in her hand. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were furious. "I had to put something back because you charged me extra. My kid went hungry that night because of you." Josh flinched. His eyes flicked between Shaq, the furious crowd, and the exit sign. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over him. His voice was calm, but lethal. "You want to explain yourself before I call the cops?" Josh's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the door. Then, he bolted. The moment the final security clip ended, the store fell into a suffocating silence. The evidence was undeniable. Josh wasn't just overcharging customers. He was straight up stealing. The footage had shown him pocketing bills, voiding transactions, and skimming money right from the register. For a second, Josh stood frozen, his entire body tense. Then, he ran. Like a cornered rat, Josh spun and bolted for the exit. The reaction was instant. In his panic, he shoved past an elderly man, nearly sending him tumbling to the floor. A metal rack toppled over, scattering chip bags everywhere. A young mother gasped as Josh brushed past her, nearly knocking the groceries out of her hands. "Shaq?" He didn't even flinch. He took one slow step forward, his massive frame blocking the only way out. Josh's sneakers screeched against the tile as he skidded to a halt. His wild eyes darted around, searching for another escape route. The crowd closed in behind him. A father, the same one Josh had scammed earlier, stepped up, fists clenched. His young daughter peeked from behind his leg, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "You're not going anywhere," the father growled. "Not after what you did." Josh's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He lifted his hands in surrender. Whoa, okay," he stammered. Look, maybe I overcharged a little, all right? But it wasn't a big deal. Just a few bucks here and there." A wave of anger rippled through the store. A young mother stepped forward, her face twisted in frustration. "A few bucks?" she snapped. "I worked 2 jobs to feed my kids. You stole from us." Josh's eyes darted toward Shaq, pleading. Come on, man, you gotta understand." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" Josh licked his lips, nervous. I was just trying to make a little extra, all right? It wasn't like I was hurting anyone." A bitter laugh came from the crowd. Then an elderly woman stepped forward. It was the same woman Josh had scammed just minutes ago. Her voice was soft but sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You made me choose between buying bread and getting my medication." Josh flinched. A hush fell over the store. Shaq took a slow breath, then reached into his pocket. Josh tensed. Then, Shaq pulled out his phone. Josh's entire body locked up, his face drained of color. No, man, please," Josh begged, his voice cracking. You don't gotta call the cops. I can fix this. I'll give the money back, I swear. Shaq tilted his head. Oh? Now you care? Josh nodded frantically. Yeah, I can pay everyone back. Please, man, don't do this. You don't understand. Shaq's expression didn't change. From the back of the crowd, a teenager spoke up. We understood just fine when you stole from us, he muttered. Now it's your turn. Josh turned desperate. His hands clenched into fists. His body trembled. Then, Shaq sighed. You know what, Josh? Josh stopped shaking. His eyes lit up with hope. Shaq nodded. You're right. Josh exhaled in relief. Oh, I'm not calling the cops. Josh's face flickered with confusion. Shaq smirked. I have a better idea. Josh's relief turned to terror. Wait, what do you mean? Josh wiped the sweat off his forehead, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had barely escaped getting arrested, or so he thought. Shaq, still standing tall with his arms crossed, studied Josh for a moment. Then, as if making a casual decision about lunch, he pulled out his phone. Josh frowned. What are you doing? Shaq didn't answer. He casually scrolled through his contacts, then pressed a button. A deep, authoritative voice picked up on the other end. Shaq? What's up, big guy? Shaq's response was simple, but devastating. Hey, can you pull the deed for a small convenience store on 8th and Main? The entire store went silent. Josh's face went ghost white. His breath hitched in his throat. Hold on, what? Shaq still didn't look at him. He kept talking into the phone. Yeah, I want to know if it's for sale. Get back to me in 5. Josh stumbled backward. You can't just buy the store. Shaq finally met his eyes and smirked. Why not? Gasps spread through the crowd. A woman whispered, Is this really happening? The teenage employee behind the counter, the same one who had exposed Josh earlier, grinned. Josh shook his head violently. No, this place isn't for sale. The owner, he wouldn't sell it. Shaq shrugged. Guess we'll see. Josh turned on his heel and sprinted toward the back office. He needed to call the store owner, stop this before it was too late. But before he could take 2 steps, Shaq grabbed the back of his hoodie and yanked him backward like a misbehaving child. Josh stumbled hard and landed in front of Shaq, looking up at him in horror. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Going somewhere? Josh's voice cracked. You don't understand, I need this job. Shaq's face darkened. No, what you needed was to be honest, but you chose to steal instead. Josh clenched his fists, shaking. It wasn't like that, man. The pay here sucks. I had to... Shaq cut him off. So your solution was to steal from your own community? Josh opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing to say. The phone in Shaq's hand buzzed. Shaq answered immediately. The entire store held its breath. The voice on the line said something and Shaq nodded. Yeah? Got it. Send the paperwork. Josh visibly swallowed. Shaq ended the call and put his phone away. Then he grinned. Looks like the owner's been thinking about selling for a while, he said casually. And lucky for me, he likes my offer. Josh physically wobbled. You're kidding, he stammered. Shaq chuckled. Nope. In about 30 minutes this place, mine. The customers erupted into shocked chatter. Josh, desperate, turned to them. You guys, you can't let this happen. I've been working here for years. The same father from earlier stepped forward, the one Josh had stolen from. He crossed his arms. Yeah, and scamming us for just as long. Josh looked around, wild-eyed. No one was on his side. Shaq tapped the counter. So Josh, how's your job security looking? Josh's face twisted in sheer panic. Wait, does this mean I'm fired? Josh's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of sheer panic. His jaw tightened as he glared at Shaq, desperation creeping into his voice. You can't just buy this place, he muttered. Shaq just laughed, shaking his head. Josh, he said, leaning against the counter. You really think I can't? The crowd murmured, watching the tension unfold. Some looked shocked, others excited. Josh shook his head violently, gripping the register like it was his last lifeline. Number no way, the owner, he'd never sell. Shaq pulled out his phone again, scrolling casually. Oh yeah? We'll see. Josh's fingers dug into the counter. His mind raced for a way out. And then, ding! The store door swung open. An older man in his 60s walked in, balding, with a slightly hunched frame and tired eyes. The real store owner. All right, the man grumbled, confused. What's going on in here? Josh froze. Mr. Goldberg. Goldberg narrowed his eyes at Josh before turning to Shaq, who extended a massive hand. Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq said with a grin. Nice place you got here. Goldberg gave him a firm shake. Uh-huh. Mind explaining why my phone's been blowing up? Shaq wasted no time. Turns out, he said, gesturing around, your guy here's been running a little side hustle. Scamming customers, overcharging, pocketing the extra cash. Goldberg's face darkened. His eyes flicked to Josh. That true? Josh's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Goldberg sighed. Josh, tell me it ain't true. Josh's voice cracked. I was just trying to make some extra. Goldberg raised a hand. Save it. Then the store owner turned to Shaq. And you? You said something about buying my store? Shaq nodded. If you're interested. Thought I'd save you the trouble of dealing with this guy any longer. Goldberg let out a long exhale. Can't lie, I was thinking about selling for a while. Josh's head snapped up. Wait, what? Goldberg ignored him. Been wanting to retire, he admitted. Spend time with the grandkids. Problem was, didn't know who to sell to. Shaq grinned. Well, lucky for you, I'm interested. Goldberg scratched his chin. You serious? You want to own a convenience store? Shaq nodded. I like investing in communities, especially when there's potential. Goldberg shrugged. Well, I ain't gonna argue with that. Let's talk numbers. Josh's stomach twisted. He couldn't let this happen. He lunged forward, gripping Goldberg's sleeve. Wait, please, I need this job. Goldberg looked at Josh's shaking hands and sighed. Shaq? He just raised an eyebrow. The store had gone dead silent. Josh's voice cracked. I messed up, okay? But I need this job. I don't have anything else. Shaq didn't respond. Instead, he did something unexpected. He turned to the customers. What do y'all think? Shaq asked, voice calm but firm. The people in the store exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they spoke. A mother stepped forward, her arms crossed. I think he should have thought about that before he stole from us. Josh's breathing turned shallow as he looked around the store. The people who had once been silent victims of his scam were now staring him down, their faces unforgiving. A woman holding her daughter's hand shook her head. He stole from all of us. An elderly man near the door muttered, Had me skipping meals 'cause I thought prices went up. But they didn't, did they? Josh couldn't move. He felt like a trapped animal, caught in a spotlight he couldn't escape. Shaq stood firm, towering over him like an immovable force. Well, Shaq said, breaking the silence, I think that settles it. He crossed his arms, his voice calm but unshakable. You heard them, he said. Josh, you're fired. Josh's face twisted in disbelief. You can't do this. His voice cracked, bordering on desperation. This is my job. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And you treated it like a scam. You ran this store like your personal piggy bank. Josh turned to Goldberg, the store's actual owner. Mr. Goldberg, please, I can fix this. Goldberg scoffed. Now you want to fix it? After you stole from my business? He shook his head, rubbing his temples. Josh, you're lucky I don't call the cops myself. Josh winced at the mention of the police. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. The crowd didn't let up. Get him out of here, someone yelled. You got caught. Deal with it. Josh gritted his teeth. He turned to Shaq, his eyes burning with anger. You think you're some kind of hero? Josh spat. Just 'cause you're rich you can waltz in here and take over? You don't know how hard life is for people like me? Shaq's expression didn't change. You're right, Shaq said. I don't know what your life is like, but I do know one thing. Stealing from struggling people ain't the way to fix it. Josh had nothing left to say. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind racing for an escape, for a way to claw back some control. But there was none. He spun on his heels and stormed toward the exit, his footsteps heavy against the tile floor. The crowd parted. No one stopped him. No one spoke up for him. Josh shoved open the door, stepping into the night air, and froze. A cop car was parked right outside. The red and blue lights flashed softly, casting a glow over the cracked pavement. Josh's stomach dropped. A uniformed officer stood beside the vehicle, arms crossed, waiting. Josh's breath hitched. He turned slowly back to the store, eyes darting to Shaq, then to Goldberg, then to the customers inside. Y'all called the cops? His voice was a mix of shock and panic. Shaq just shrugged. Wasn't me, he said casually. Guess somebody else wanted to see justice done. Josh's head snapped toward the crowd, and that's when he saw it. The young employee from earlier, the one who exposed the working security cameras, was standing by the register, phone in hand. Josh's face twisted in betrayal. You? The teen shrugged. You made us all feel like we didn't have a choice. Well, now you don't. Josh staggered backward, his heart pounding. The officer stepped forward. Josh Parker, the officer said, pulling out a pair of cuffs. We need to have a little chat. Josh disappeared into the night, the red and blue flashing lights reflecting off the store's glass windows. For the first time all evening, the tension inside the convenience store broke. A woman let out a breath of relief. A father clapped his hands together. A group of teens near the back whispered excitedly. Then, the store erupted into cheers. About time, one man shouted. That crook had it coming. Shaq let the noise settle, then turned toward the employees still standing behind the counter. Some looked nervous, some relieved. All right, Shaq said, stepping forward. Let's talk. The remaining employees, 3 young cashiers and a stock boy in the back, looked at each other uneasily. Shaq leaned on the counter, arms crossed. Listen, I get it. Not everybody's built to stand up to a guy like Josh, he said. But here's the thing. I need to know the truth. Who else was in on this? The store fell silent. The young workers shifted uncomfortably. Then, the teenage employee, the one who had exposed the security footage, stepped forward. My name's Kevin, he said, voice steady but nervous. And I wasn't part of it. I swear. I needed this job. Shaq studied him. Kevin looked young, maybe 18, barely out of high school. He had the kind of wide-eyed determination that came with someone who wanted to do the right thing, even if it scared him. Shaq nodded. I believe you. Kevin swallowed hard and glanced at the others. But some of them knew, he admitted. They didn't steal, but they knew. And they didn't say anything. Shaq turned his gaze to the 2 remaining cashiers, both middle-aged, both avoiding eye contact. Is that true? Shaq asked. The first cashier, a woman named Janice, hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. I didn't steal, she said quickly. But Josh was my manager. He told me to keep my mouth shut, so I did. The second cashier, an older man with a graying beard, sighed heavily. Same here. I got bills to pay, man. I couldn't afford to lose this job. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. I get it, he said, but that doesn't make it right. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Then Shaq straightened up. All right, here's what's gonna happen, he announced. The employees held their breath. Anybody who was in on this scam, you're out. Janice's eyes widened. Wait, please, I'm not saying you stole, Shaq interrupted, but you stood by while people got cheated out of their money. That ain't gonna fly in my store. The older cashier just nodded, accepting his fate. He grabbed his apron and set it on the counter before walking out without a word. Janice wiped her eyes, whispered, I'm sorry, and hurried after him. Now, only Kevin remained. The teen shifted on his feet, nervous. Shaq smirked. You, Kevin, Shaq said. Just got a promotion. Kevin's eyes went wide. Wait, what? Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. You're the only one who stood up to Josh. You told the truth, even when it could have cost you, Shaq said. That tells me you got integrity. And that's exactly what this store needs. Kevin blinked in shock. You want me to be manager? Damn right I do. The store burst into applause. Customers cheered. Some patted Kevin on the back. The teenager looked overwhelmed, his face flushing with pride. I won't let you down, he promised. Shaq grinned. Good, 'cause we got work to do. Kevin nodded. Then Shaq turned to the crowd. Now, he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. Let's do something special. The customers murmured in curiosity. What did Shaq have planned next? The store wasn't just staying open. It was about to become something much bigger. Shaq stood in the middle of the convenience store, surveying the shelves, the counters, the broken-down register. The store had good bones, it just needed a better purpose. Then he turned to the people still gathered around. This place has been running a scam for too long, he said, his deep voice commanding the room. Now? We're flipping the script. The customers leaned in, curious. Shaq grinned. We're turning this store into something this community actually needs. A discount shop. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Discount? A man in a work uniform repeated. Like lower prices? Shaq nodded. No more scams. No more overpriced groceries. We do business right. Kevin, the newly promoted manager, straightened his shoulders, excitement flashing in his eyes. You serious? He asked. Shaq smirked. Always. Kevin let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. Man, people are gonna lose their minds. Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. Then let's give him something to talk about. Within hours, Shaq's phone was blowing up. He called in favors, partners, sponsors, anyone who could help. He made it clear. This wasn't just a store anymore. It was a mission. Companies jumped on board. Local suppliers offered discounts. A major grocery chain donated goods. Even a security company stepped up, offering free cameras and alarms to protect the store from future scams. Kevin, still in shock over his sudden promotion, took charge of organizing everything. "Shaq," he said, checking inventory sheets. "This is insane. We've got more stock coming in than I've ever seen." Shaq grinned. "Good, because we're about to open doors with a bang." A week later, the storefront was completely transformed. A new sign hung above the entrance. Shaq's Save-A-Lot. The once dim interior was now bright and welcoming. Shelves were stocked with fresh produce, essentials, and affordable meals. And the prices? Fair. Honest. The way they should have been all along. Shaq stood at the front, surveying the crowd gathered outside. Dozens of people from the neighborhood, single parents, elderly residents, struggling families, had come, all eager to see if the rumors were true. Shaq stepped forward, grabbing the mic. "I grew up in a community just like this," he said, his deep voice filled with conviction. "I know what it's like to stretch a dollar. I know what it's like when prices go up, but your paycheck stays the same." Heads nodded in agreement. They knew exactly what he meant. "This store used to take advantage of people," Shaq continued. "That ends today." A wave of cheers erupted. He smiled. "From now on, fair prices, discounts for seniors and single parents, and if someone can't afford food..." Shaq nodded to Kevin, who stepped up beside him. "We make sure they eat," Kevin finished. The crowd went wild. The doors officially opened, and the first person to step forward was an elderly woman clutching a small purse. Shaq recognized her immediately. It was the same woman Josh had scammed that night. The same woman who had counted her money with shaking hands, trying to afford bread and milk. She hesitated at the threshold, looking at the transformed store in disbelief. Shaq smiled gently. "Come on in, ma'am. First one's on the house." Tears filled her eyes. "Bless you, son." As she walked inside, Shaq knew this wasn't just a business anymore. It was a second chance. But would the community truly accept the change? And would Shaq's new store last or attract new enemies? The grand reopening was nothing short of a spectacle. The once dingy convenience store, a place known for scamming struggling families, was now something entirely different. Freshly painted walls, bright welcoming lights, shelves stacked with affordable groceries. Even the sign above the entrance was new, bold and proud. Shaq's Save-A-Lot. The word had spread fast. By the time the doors were set to open, a crowd had gathered outside. Young mothers with kids, elderly couples who had once struggled to afford food, hardworking men and women who had been forced to choose between rent and groceries. They weren't just here to shop. They were here to see if this was real. And Shaq? He was right there, standing at the front. Shaq stepped forward, surveying the crowd. He could see the skepticism in some faces, the hope in others. He picked up the microphone and cleared his throat. "First off," Shaq said, his deep voice cutting through the morning air, "I want to say thank you." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This store used to take advantage of people," Shaq continued, his tone serious. "But that's not how we do business. Not anymore." He gestured behind him. "This place belongs to all of you now." People exchanged glances. Was this really happening? Shaq smirked. "And since today's a special day," he turned to Kevin, the newly promoted store manager. "How much we charging for groceries today?" Kevin grinned. "First 10 customers? Free." The crowd erupted. The doors swung open, and the first wave of customers walked in hesitantly. One of them was an elderly woman, frail, small, the same one Josh had scammed weeks ago. Shaq recognized her instantly. She stopped at the entrance, clutching a small worn-out purse. "You go ahead, ma'am," Kevin told her warmly. "Take what you need." Her hands shook as she reached for a loaf of bread, then a carton of milk. When she reached the register, Shaq was waiting. He tapped the counter, grinning. "You remember me?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I do." Shaq gestured to her groceries. "That's on the house." She pressed a wrinkled hand to her chest, overwhelmed. "Bless you, son." Shaq smiled. "You enjoy, ma'am." The news of the store's transformation spread fast. Local news outlets showed up, cameras rolling, reporters eager to capture the story of how a former scam store became a beacon of hope. The anchor's voice boomed from the TVs inside. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal has done it again, turning a once corrupt business into a community-driven store for low-income families. And as for the man behind the original scam, Shaq folded his arms, watching the report. The camera cut to a mugshot. Josh, the same cashier who had ripped people off, was now behind bars. Turns out he had tried the same scam at another store. Only this time, he got caught. Kevin laughed, shaking his head. Guess karma moves fast. Shaq smirked. Sometimes you just gotta help it along. As the day wound down, a little girl, no older than 6, walked up to Shaq. She tugged at his sleeve. He looked down, surprised. "What's up, lil one?" She tilted her head. "Are you the owner now?" Shaq chuckled. He kneeled to her level. "Nah, kid. I'm just making sure no one gets scammed again." And with that, he stood up, smiling as he watched the store come to life. The shelves stocked, the cash registers ringing, the people laughing. A once crooked store was now changing lives. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Comment below.